Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. I'm Matthew with my co-host Matt, or Matt with my co-host Matthew, whichever way you want to view it. Last episode, we discussed the first live debate or discussion that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson had. And eventually, we're going to try to get through all of these because they're very substantive debates. Both of them have very interesting points of view, but both of them have very compelling arguments. They're both very good public speakers, and of course, both moderators, Brett Weinstein and Douglas Murray, are also good foils for them. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the second debate, but we didn't quite know what jumping off point. So I'm going to give a very strange jumping off point and give us a brief analysis of Batman versus Superman. And I was telling my friend here that the movie is, I think, very. It's almost giving a Peterson-esque argument in favor of religion. And what do I mean by that? So, but if you haven't watched the movie and you want to, spoilers, move to a later part of the podcast. So because I'm going to be giving some spoilers. So the villain in the movie is Lex Luthor. And Lex Luthor is trying to he introduces Batman and Superman because he's hoping that they'll destroy each other, basically. And in a lot of Superman movies, at least the last two that have come out, there's a very direct parallel of Superman is God. But it goes deeper than that, of course, because in the end of the movie, well, first off, Lex Luthor creates this monster that is a combination of both his DNA and General Zod's DNA, and of course the monster's released out into the city and is destroying everything. And Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman are going off to fight it. Batman dies, and so I'm reminded. Jordan Peterson, of course, is a good student of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. And Nietzsche, one thing he's known for is the quote, "God is dead." Now, I think actually Hegel originally came up with that quote, but it's well known that Nietzsche is kind of he's associated with that quote. And of course, Nietzsche believes that what he means is religious faith is dying. Religious faith doesn't have the power and the sway that it did. And so, of course, at a simplistic level, the movie's saying, well, okay, Superman or God is dying. And so Lex Luthor, in some sense, is like this atheist Ubermensch, the atheist Superman, the Overman, or he thinks he's the Overman, or the step beyond man that Nietzsche is advocating for. And but of course, there are also hints at the end of the movie that, in fact, Superman will not be dead forever. And so I took this as the movie saying, well, okay, you can't have, you can't kill God, you can't kill religion, because then there's a religion-shaped hole and people will lose hope. And so it's a very pro-religious movie. Which is, of course, very interesting to me because I'm fairly anti-religious. Are you following me?
Yeah, and I haven't seen Batman vs Superman, and I didn't really care if it was spoiled for me because I'm not intending on watching it anytime soon. And I'm not the biggest comic book hero, or I'm not a big fan of those types of films. But I've seen enough to see similar things played out in ways that I think are interesting and kind of related. I mean, like the whole idea of Thanos and the Thanos snap, and killing half the people for his consequentialist purposes has some sort of more moral message of not using people as means to an end, and like it implies that he is not properly valuing human life. So there's all these messages in there, and that's what they do a lot. Like with what it sounds like that Lex Luthor character is kind of attempting to control people, and a lot of those villains often know what's better for society. And then that's how we were also talking about Watchmen, and I don't know how much you remember it, but one of the main villains, his whole idea is if I destroy New York, then I'm going to save millions of other lives because I'm going to stop this war from happening before it starts. So, and it's like he's smarter than everybody else, so he's going to play it. He knows how to play it, but we all have this intrinsic intuition that that's wrong. And I know I'm getting off topic of the religious part of what you're saying about Batman and God being dead, but I did think it's interesting that a lot of these movies have these almost what's the word for it? Feelingless, statistic-driven, emotionless people who are not supposed to have these intrinsic values that people often ascribe to maybe religion. It's probably implied that a lot of these consequentialists are like non-feeling atheist types, and it's almost like that's a negative archetype. And I think that relates a lot to what you're saying about Batman versus Superman. And I think it's funny too because I got to wrap it always around to how I hate government. And that type of not feeling type is like the ideal social planning person who thinks that if they had access to all the resources, they could distribute it perfectly. And it's kind of like this, I know what's better for society, I should be able to plan it all out type of villain. And I just see that in our government. And I think that's in my mind, I read that as oh, hey, look, this person's acting like the government does. But obviously that's not how society usually interprets those movies. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that movie up and talked about it a little bit. Did you want to add anything before we kind of dive into the debate?
The only thing, I guess, well, I'll add two things. One, the interesting thing about Watchmen, and I should say I read the graphic novel, I did not see the movie, but the interesting thing about Watchmen was that in the end, all the superheroes, they basically gave in to that consequentialist calculus. They just said, well, he's right, technically this even though he released this, I guess it was a monster or an alien or something in New York killing God knows how many people, but technically it's going to be saving these other people and it's going to bring universal peace. And so it's you can't argue with that. And so that was a very interesting and provocative aspect to that story. And then the other thing that I'll add about Batman v Superman, it also reminded me of something called Death of God Theology, which is an interesting it's a trend in modern theology, which, as it sounds, it's what they call radical theology, because it takes very different interpretations from the traditional interpretations, and some of them like literally think Death of God theologians say, well, God literally dies, and then others say no, that's like the Nietzschean metaphor for a lack of belief nowadays. And so the movie sort of like both upset me, but also I agreed with it to some extent, because a prominent Death of God theologian nowadays, his name is Peter Rollin, and he released a video, I think, on his YouTube channel where he says atheists aren't atheistic enough. And what he meant by that was what the Nietzsche's point, which is, well, if people who have a history of religion, or they at least grow up in a culture which traditionally has been religious, they do have a God-shaped hole, and quite often they put in, I don't know, politics. They put in a certain ideology for God, or it's money, or it's power, or it's love, or it's humanity, and there's all these other things that you can put in for God, which can lead you to do terrible things, or at least believe terrible things. And I agree with this. That is a problem, and we have to, if we want to live in a secular world, or at least a world in which religion has less of a sway than it does, we need to acknowledge the power that religion has had, and the power that it still has, and we need to understand maybe what we could do to replace it.
Well, and that's one of the driving forces behind Jordan Peterson's motivations. I think one of the reasons he clings to the story so much is he looks at history and says a lot of times where people have abandoned using some of these books as a guiding principle, stuff has gone fully chaotic. It's like people have strayed from morals that were preached and then adopted nihilism, and tyranny has ensued. And I think that that's at least what he would say is his interpretation, and that's why he ends up trying to pull out the good from the religion. I think that's his main fear, is what replaces that hole, that as God dies, in the average person's life, what is going to replace it. And that's what you hear a lot from people who are like, I guess, like the typical popular, a lot of right-wing pundits right now, like Ben Shapiro. He talks about that God-shaped hole in people's hearts all the time, and he uses that to explain things like young people killing themselves at higher rates, or being addicted to drugs, and it's because they're not replacing it with anything that's meaningful, right? And I don't think I think there's definitely something to that. That's what I would say. Okay, so let's start diving into the debate a little bit, and I'm sure we're going to wrap around into those topics. So I think we're just going to go through it in a relatively linear way, because we both just took notes as we were watching. And I think I'm just going to kind of go through an order, and maybe if we're running long, we'll skip some parts and focus on things that are maybe most interesting to us. But when they initially start, they kind of steel man each other's positions. But then they quickly get into the topic of and you want to talk about this last week, it was a truth and metaphorical truth. And I guess Brett defined metaphorical truth as literally false, but beneficial, regardless of that fact. So a couple of examples they gave of metaphorical truth was like the idea of a porcupine. If you thought porcupines could shoot their quills, you would stay really far away from them, because you have to be really far away from something that can shoot its quills at you. But we all know porcupines can't shoot their quills. But nonetheless, if you thought they could shoot their quills, you'd stay really far away from them, and it would benefit you. You're less likely to have a porcupine-related accident. And then Sam Harris expanded on a different idea, which is how gun owners treat their guns like they're loaded at all times, to a seemingly ridiculous degree. And treat every gun like it's loaded. You're repetitively making sure it's unloaded, but you're still holding it and not pointing at anything that you think has value, because you don't want to accidentally shoot it, even though you've tested it out 10 times to know that it's empty. So all these things, like believing the gun's always loaded, well, it's not, but it's beneficial to act in that manner. So do you want to expand on that thought a little bit of this concept?
Yes, I do. Because I remember, I don't remember if this was recorded on the episode itself, or if it was our after show conversation, but I remember you saying something to the effect of, well, I don't think, or I suspect that, that I view metaphorical truth as not true. So I wanted to clarify something. I would not say necessarily that metaphorical truth isn't, in some sense, true. I think it depends on the metaphor, and I kind of think this was something Sam Harris brought up. Not all metaphors are created equal, would be one way of thinking about it. So the idea of treating a gun as if it's loaded, even if it's not loaded, that's a very useful fiction. Again, even if a gun is, even if for a fact, you just opened it up 2 minutes ago and there were no bullets in there, it's still useful. For the very reason that there could be a time when the gun is loaded and you didn't think about it, and then there's some disaster that goes on. But then I would say there are other truths, or there are other metaphors which I don't think are as useful. And I would say that generally speaking, religion or religious dogma is metaphorical truth, which is not useful, or not. It does more harm than good.
Okay. So I don't know how much in disagreement we are on the broad topic of like some lies being beneficial. The more I think about it, the less I like the phrase metaphorical truth, because the whole point is metaphorical truth is a beneficial falsehood. That's kind of how I define it. So it's like, well, you probably shouldn't call it a truth. It's okay to, I think, admit that it's a falsehood. And I apologize for the background noise in North Philadelphia if you're getting some of that. I don't know how much I want to push back on the idea of more harm than good, because that is a phrase that I was catching a lot of throughout this debate. And that's something that Sam Harris says a lot, and I generally do have a problem with it for very specific reasons. So I don't know if we want to dive into that now, or if we, because that gets off topic of metaphorical truth very quickly. But I guess to maybe try to put a bow on metaphorical truth, I think it can be very valuable in certain situations. There are a lot of, I mean, I guess it's definitional. If it's metaphorically true, then it has to be beneficial. But I can't think of a ton of examples of it in my life as a secular person.
Can I give one example? Another example?
Yeah. Go for it.
I think a good example of metaphorical truth that most of us, at least, live by is, this concept of the meaning of life. Now, if you,
I think I'm like, we're on the same wavelength, because I was thinking that, but I didn't want to say it because because I don't want to go down a nihilistic rabbit hole, and I'm not the most. Sometimes I get kind of nihilistic. So, but yeah, you should finish that thought though.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to say quickly that I think technically speaking, like, life is meaningless and there really is nothing. This is kind of just a cosmic, in some sense, a cosmic accident. And there's really no, we don't know, why did the Big Bang happen? You ask that to physicists and they tell you can't say that. We don't know. So technically speaking, the literal truth, I don't think there is a meaning to life, but I think that we, in some sense, as humans, have to live as if there is meaning to life, just because that's kind of the way our brains work. That's just kind of the way we interpret the world. And so in that sense, I wouldn't say just because that's not literally true, just because you can't find the meaning, you're not going to go to the African savannah and find meaning in its raw and purest form, but you can still have meaning. I can still enjoy or get pleasure out of, conversations and reading and going out with friends and family, in my subjective experience, even if technically speaking, it's not true.
Now, I think that might be walking a very thin line between what is supposed to be metaphorical truth and what is dogmatic, because you're kind of talking about something that's axiomatic to like our day-to-day life. And it's like kind of a root principle that there are people who kind of just adopt the belief that life is meaningful kind of because it has to be in and of itself. And I'm not to say like you shouldn't think that, but it's almost adopted purely out of belief and convenience because it makes life better to believe that. So I guess I guess if we get to these core principles, I don't know if I'm ready to lump that into metaphorical truth, like the meaning of life. But shortcuts and heuristics about maybe animals being dangerous, it's like, okay, I can get behind that. Hey, do you get the distinction I'm trying to make, I guess?
Could you flesh that out a bit more, actually?
Well, like it's very clear the gun example where it's like, eventually, if you don't treat a gun in this way with the utmost security and you aren't over the top about making sure your gun isn't loaded, you can have an accident that has a very tangible payoff of, shooting somebody or something that you didn't want to shoot. But when you're talking about like a defining characteristic to how you live your life completely day to day, and something that will guide your emotions, like believing life is meaningful, and you're more taking that on faith so you can operate like as a whole. I think that goes beyond kind of the small beneficial things that they were trying to get at when they discussed metaphorical truth. Or was I just perceiving their conversation too narrowly?
Well, I guess what I would say in response to that is I really think there's pretty much only one group of people who, and in some sense, I'm almost going to sound like Jordan Peterson here, which is ironic, but in some sense, there's only one group of people which acts like there is no meaning to life, and I would say that's, some sociopaths or some psychopaths, people who really don't have, for whatever reason, they don't have the ability to empathize. They don't really have the ability to, believe in a broader sense. And those are the people that are, committing atrocious crimes in some sense, just because there really is, to them, they can't get past the, I guess in some sense, their disability, but also just the literal fact that, well, there is no meaning to life. And so nothing matters. And so in some sense, I guess I would say that there is there can be a substantial consequence, a substantial and dangerous consequence of not acting as if life is meaningful.
I mostly agree with that. I'm afraid that if I point out probably the nuances I disagree, we actually would get trapped in the game of how to define what is meaning, and then that's kind of like completely unrelated, and that's me just nitpicking. So I think if I accept the definition of meaning you were using, then I agree with that, so we're good. And I think we squared that circle if I just concede that and I don't get caught up on overanalyzing the meaning of the word meaning. So I think we should jump ahead. I think we tied that off nicely, and I agree with your thoughts overall on that. So I think the next topic I started writing notes on was when Jordan Peterson starts talking about sacrifice. So I don't know if you have a lot of thoughts there. I guess to kind of lead off on that, well, I actually had like a meta point about Jordan Peterson that I kind of perceived while he was talking about sacrifice, and it really clicked for me how easy it is to or how hard it is to pin down Jordan Peterson's actual position. Because to me, maybe it's because I agree with him more, or I find his arguments compelling, at least to some extent. Like, I'm not willing to reject what he has to say, like some new atheist-leaning people are. So I usually give him the benefit of the doubt, and I don't normally find it particularly important to pin down exactly what he's arguing. And as he's talking about sacrifice, I found it very easy to kind of be confused if he was really defending sacrifice or if he was just trying to understand, the origins of it, right? Because part of what Jordan Peterson's really doing is he's trying to understand the origins of a lot of the human universal intuitions. So, depending on how you interpret his motivation when he's making this argument about human sacrifice, it can be really easy to, I guess, have a different takeaway to what he's saying. So with me providing that background, do you want to share some of your reactions to him talking about it? Okay.
Well, my interpretation of what Peterson was saying, I did take the interpretation that he was trying to understand the meaning of sacrifice. And I guess one thing I would say, I would just kind of reiterate something Sam Harris was saying. There's nothing wrong with the belief in certain situations and in certain circumstances. There's nothing wrong with believing that sacrifice is a net good. So if I want to learn French, for example, I have to sacrifice some of my time in order to study the language, in order so that future me can have that skill of speaking and reading and writing French. So I really don't have any criticism of that. I guess what I would say is the the line seems to blur for me, especially with Christianity, about where do you draw the line between like that kind of sacrificing your time or sacrificing certain pleasures in the now, for a greater good, and where you draw the and between the ancient practice of human sacrifice, because I think we can both agree that human sacrifice is not a constructive thing to do. It's a barbaric thing, and we would not advocate for sacrifice. And something that sort of bothers me about Peterson, and it's slightly off topic, but I think it's relevant. He was, and this kind of goes back, I guess, to dogma a bit, but I'll say it anyway. He was asked about the question, does he believe that Christ was resurrected? And he just refuses to answer that question. But I think that's a very important question. Was he resurrected? But even a broader point, what does it mean for someone for a human to sacrifice themselves or be sacrificed? Like, what does that mean? I think I'm very suspicious of the idea that, Jesus sacrificed himself for my sins. I'm very suspicious of that because, as Christopher Hitchens would say, I can pay your debt. If you rack up debt, I could theoretically pay for that. Or I could also theoretically serve your time in prison. But I can't take away your responsibility. If you do something abhorrent, I can't say, well, it's as if I did that and you had nothing to do with that. No matter what I do, you still have that moral responsibility. So I think that's my distinction. I'm suspicious of Christianity's history of human sacrifice, and I think that needs to be fleshed out more.
I have a couple thoughts on that. So I have I don't want to put words in Jordan Peterson's mouth, but I think I know why he's not willing to see that Jesus wasn't actually resurrected. And I think part of that is self-serving on his part, and part of it is, well, I think they're both self-serving, but in different ways, right? Because a lot of people that do like Jordan Peterson are people who are actually religious, and then they're now going through their religion not as just dogma, but they're also trying to derive values in the way he's analyzing it. So if he was to, I guess, outwardly take this atheistic stance, then he could potentially think he's going to alienate some people. That's like the, I guess, most offensive to him interpretation of why he won't admit it. But what I think the true, or I guess like the overall reason why he doesn't want to make that concession is, I think he thinks that saying that it's not literally true is almost, he thinks it's like missing the point. So he thinks if he cedes that point, then people aren't going to really care what his interpretation is, because it's like, yeah, but you're agreeing that it's just like, didn't happen, so whatever, why do we care that much? And I don't think he wants to cede that point to an atheist he's talking to, because then they'll kind of, they could potentially hand wave the whole thing and say, well, it's like, well, you're admitting it doesn't really matter more than any other book, so why are we spending time on it? And I don't think that's, so I think he's doing it self-servingly in the sense that he thinks he'll lose points. He thinks his message would be hurt if he's willing to reject that part of the dogma. And then there is, he argues about interpreting the Bible as a narrative, and he has a few other points that I think would more be technical, I guess, that I don't think I'd be able to defend. But I think those are probably the most likely reasons. If you want to jump on that before I talk about Christianity and sacrifice, but I do want to wrap around to my thoughts on that too.
Well, yeah, there's, I guess, a few things I could say. I suspect it is somewhat self-serving why he refuses to answer the question. He's basically saying, he won't even say, yes, I believe it, or no, I don't. He's dodging the question. And he does the same for, do you believe in God? What do you mean by belief? What do you mean by God? And so here's the thing. There is a philosopher. I want to say he was Dutch. I don't remember exactly where he was from, but Spinoza. He was described, I think, by a Romantic poet as or a historian or someone as a God-intoxicated man. Now, what did they mean by this? Because Spinoza was, believed in a deterministic universe, or he was a pantheist. So basically, he believed that the universe was God, and God was the universe, or God is the universe. And of course, that's really, if you get down to it, that's really atheism, but it's atheism which still uses God as a metaphor. And here's the thing: if the majority of people used religion and God, used religious language, if it were almost always metaphorical, I would spend less time criticizing it. And here's the funny thing, and this might be shocking and surprising. I think there is one religion in the Abrahamic tradition which basically, not exactly, but basically does this, and that's Judaism. For the most part, most Jews don't believe in the literal truth of the Torah, but they somehow retain a certain aspect of Jewishness. And so in some sense, you could almost say that Judaism is a non-religious religion. Now, that wasn't always true, and there are, of course, Orthodox Jews which would want to claw my eyes out for saying that. And of course, if we ever talk about the Israeli-Palestine conflict, well, that has something to do with Orthodox Judaism. So it's definitely not a perfect religion, and it's not a perfect synopsis of the entire tradition. But to put it to put it in a phrase, if I were to convert to a religion, it would be a moderate form of Judaism for that reason.
So I guess I'll try to make my points quick, but the thought I was also having about Jordan Peterson, and I guess I don't necessarily like how you said he dodges the if he believes in God question. And I think it's because he doesn't want to say things that he thinks his opponents will intentionally use as a blunt instrument against him, because he doesn't mean if he said, no, I don't believe in a Christian God, I think it would be used against him in a way that it would almost be potentially disingenuous, because he believes in pretty much all the values that he derives from the Bible, it seems, because he believes that those values line up with a lot of human universals for the most part. And then those are what he thinks are guiding human morality. I think that seems to be how he roots things. So I think that's why he is very hesitant to answer that question in a direct way, because I don't think that he believes in a Christian God, but I think he kind of says, but if I say this, people are going to say things that don't properly reflect my view, so I don't want to drop this type of phrasing. And it's like, you can think that that's disingenuous of him. I'm kind of indifferent on it. I understand that maneuvering tactic in terms of promulgating your message, and I'm okay with it. And I think the way he sees it, that really differs from you and Sam Harris, is he's okay with people becoming religious now in the modern age, because people who are becoming religious now are often using it to get some sort of moral compass, because like imagine nihilistic 20-year-olds that are partying and doing drugs, as opposed to a lot of people I know that are my age that are 23 and are getting married. Almost all of them are religious. And if you're supportive of that family structure, it's easy to say, well, I'd rather people convert into these values than potentially finding values without God, etc. And I think that's the trade-off where you guys really differ. But that's aside the point. I just kind of want to get that out there. The other thing I want to add real quick was everything about Jesus dying for your sins, I actually think is probably one of the most amazing, profound messages of Christianity, because it's this powerful idea that no matter what you do, you are not beyond redemption. And that if you truly have a change of heart, there is somebody that will be willing to redeem you and accept you for it, despite the things you've done wrong, despite your sins. And I don't know if that's necessarily true because people won't forgive you in life, but that's an overwhelmingly hopeful, positive message that in that typical, I guess, interpretation that you hear in the modern age a lot of it's okay, he'll forgive you, you just have to believe in him. That hope for people who are broken, and a lot of people have done horrible things, and like think of Alcoholics Anonymous, things like that. That message can be profound to some people. It can speak to some people. It doesn't speak to me at all. I couldn't care less. But there are people that it can help. That's the value I see in that message. If we want to get back to a big picture discussion that I think we're angling towards, is the idea of religion and its trade-offs, and there are pros and cons. And I think this is where I kind of get annoyed with Sam Harris in both debates we've watched. Is that something you're okay with angling towards and me setting that up? Okay. So do you want to add something before?
I'd like to add one thing really quickly, then you can
okay.
Angle towards that general discussion. Like on a quick point about that message about that message you take away from Christianity. That is an interpretation. I've talked about the subreddit called Radical Christianity because I'm always on Reddit, and it's people. That's where you'd find people who say, yes, the true meaning of Christianity is that everything is forgiven, and that's sort of a Unitarian Universalist message. Although it's even deeper than that particular qualification. But I would not say that is even the overwhelming message of Christianity, or that has been the message historically. I think that's a very recent deviation, and I don't think most Christians actually believe that. If you got their if you really pin them to the wall and ask them, do you really believe everyone's forgiven? I think most most Christians would say no.
So, okay, I think what you said, whether I agree with it or not, is actually perfect to the conversation I'm angling towards, because you mentioned how historically that might not be the most common interpretation, and then there are other people who may not truly believe that interpretation. So the reason I'm so frustrated when you or Sam Harris say, well, we're looking at religion through this lens, the good, even if there is some good, does not outweigh the bad. I just think that's like a ridiculous way of even looking at it, because there is no reason why you have to throw away something in all scenarios if you acknowledge that there are times where it's good. Now, this is the crux of what I think was so. I think this is the argument that Sam Harris failed to address in both debates, where they kind of, but with Peterson and Weinstein both kind of brought it up in different ways, but they were talking about how these narrative messages are better at spreading, and they actually scale better. Because at one point, Sam Harris said, let's see. So he said, religion gives bad reasons to be good when there are good reasons to be good. And then Sam Harris said, good reasons scale better. And then Brett Weinstein's like, no, they don't. Why would the Bible still be around if having a good reason scales better than a narrative reason? And I think that this is a very important point, because there are plenty of people who, you can make a reasonable argument for why they should believe something, or you can try to derive into your morals in certain ways. But there are going to be people who will not grasp that the same way they can grasp a story from the Bible and the message that story leaves with you. There's reasons why I remember many more movies that I've seen than arguments made in nonfiction books I listen to. It's because there's something about a narrative structure that leaves you with a moral that you internalize a lot better. So I don't think Sam Harris has made a compelling point to that. And to just say, well, religion has caused atrocities means we should dump it. It's like, well, if it's promulgating good messages in an effective way, even if it's been utilized negatively plenty of times, if it does things well, then shouldn't it keep doing those things well? Why don't you just only get rid of the things it does bad? So that's kind of where I've been left after watching both the debates.
Okay, so one of the books by one of the new atheists, Dr. Daniel Dennett, is called "Breaking the Spell: Religion as a Natural Phenomenon." And of course, I think it was Brett Weinstein who brought up religion as a Darwinian phenomenon. So, in other words, there is some adaptive. Brett Reinstein would argue that we need to look at religion from an evolutionary perspective, and that religion is not what Richard Dawkins would say a mind virus. Religion is an adaptation because, and we know this because it has stuck around for so long and it continues to stick around, and that the new atheist interpretation is simplistic and too literal. And there's nothing wrong with having a Darwinian interpretation of religion. I think it was Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion. He said, if a kid, it's probably beneficial evolutionarily for a kid to follow the instructions of his parents, because, if his parent says, don't play near the cliff over there, there's a reason that the parent is saying that. The parent is saying that because there's a chance that if the kid is playing near the cliff, he could fall over and hurt himself or die. But we don't have to accept something just because it has been there's an evolutionary reason for it. There's an evolutionary reason. This is a slightly bad analogy, but I'm using it to make my point as clear as possible. There's an evolutionary reason for tribal violence. There's an evolutionary reason for genocide. There's so many things that there are evolutionary reasons for that we as human beings don't have to accept, and we can try to move past them. And so, that would be my response.
No, I 110% agree with everything you said about essentially the naturalistic fallacy. I bring that up all the time when people talk about the morality of eating meat. And the people, I've literally talked to dudes who are, because I'm kind of sympathetic to animal rights movement, and I know this is a random aside. This isn't to be debated. You're not allowed to respond to it. I'll go to a real point in a minute. But I've talked to dudes who are kind of brutes sometimes, and they'll be like, "We're at the top of the animal kingdom. We got this way because we can catch and kill all the animals. Like, if I want to eat meat, I'm going to eat meat." I'm like, we're not even talking about that, dude. I'm just saying it's a living thing, blah, blah. I'm going to still eat meat because I'm a bad person, but I feel like there might be something wrong with that we might get to in 100 years. So I agree with the whole naturalistic fallacy stuff. Totally. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think I spelled out my point well enough. I think my point is kind of bringing back to why I get annoyed with collective language. Right. So remember when we used to, in the old days, 2 episodes ago, we used to talk about things that were more political, and I would talk about individualism a lot. So I would say there are certain things, like when I hate when people talk about the U.S. economy like it can be divvied up, because the U.S. economy is made up of a ton of people's incomes. They're all separate, but once people collectivize it, they act like it's a new thing when it's not. You shouldn't be able to split it up just because everybody's income, and you decided to use words that frame it like it's all communal when it isn't. So I guess what I'm saying is when you talk about how, well, it's done worse things here and it's done more harm than good, I think you're assuming that just because it's done more harm than good on a broad scale historically, that's a good enough reason to say, to I guess, write it off. But in my mind, if it can convert one alcoholic, terrible parent, and all of a sudden, for some reason, a dogmatic religious message hits him in his core, and he wouldn't be persuaded by statistics that tell him how to be a better dad, because that's just not moving, I don't see that that's bad enough to just do away with religion. Because I guess what I'm saying is the historic context doesn't matter to a random dude who's an alcoholic that's encountering religion. It's irrelevant. It's a case-by-case basis. So why can't we apply this case-by-case basis when we're reasoning about religion as a whole? Why can't we say, yeah, some people are going to be irrational and believe this book that we find stupid, and they're going to be dogmatists, but you know what? It will make some of their lives better, and I'm okay with that. I guess that's my problem with Sam Harris. He's not willing to accept that because they're believing in something that's not true. And he could say, well, why don't we just intervene in that dad's life and tell him how to be a better dad? And it's like, because it doesn't work with our lizard brains the same way religion does. And why can't we accept that? Because that clearly has some validity. So That's the point I'm trying to make, I guess. There are individual cases where religion helps people, and that's good enough to say it's salvageable, because why don't we keep doing it where it helps, right? And then we can slowly work off the ways where it does the most harm, like we've clearly been doing for hundreds of years, because now we don't do wars like the Crusades. We find other dumb reasons to go to war instead of religion. We've improved. We've made pseudo-rational reasons. But we also don't do, in a serious note, we don't do human sacrifice anymore in the United States, right? And it's like we've grown past that. So why can't we grow past the most harmful things that people could argue and then just, keep the little things that work?
I have a comment, and then I want to ask you a question. So my comment, this gets back to a discussion we had, I think it was last episode, about human nature. While acknowledging that there are dark aspects, there are destructive aspects of human nature, I just don't believe that that people are so brain dead or that they all go by their lizard brains, and they just can't. They don't have the capacity to rationally think about it. The alcoholic doesn't. I don't want to say the alcoholic, oh well, he just doesn't have. He's not intelligent enough to understand that, why he should be a good dad rationally. So he has to be persuaded by an irrational argument of, well, if you don't fix your ways, you're gonna rot in hell. Okay, but here's my question. I can assure you that Scientology helps alcoholics, helps people get off drugs. I can assure you that Scientology does those good things, and yet society views Scientology as a pernicious and deadly cult. So how do you square that? Would you say that, Scientology, because Scientology does some good, therefore, it is good? Or how would you, what would you say to that?
So I actually think that's really, well, so I think there's an unintentional prong of that question that I'll address first, and then I'll give the more satisfying answer. The unintentional prong is that the respectability of religions really has to do with political correctness. It's just political correctness going towards the right-wing values, so you don't hear about it as often in the mainstream. I am not a fan of political correctness, and I will blatantly state my absolute disdain or disregard towards things that plenty of people view as positive or favorable. So I'm not too concerned with that. So if I was going to disregard Scientology, I'd probably do it for it being, dogma. I'd do it just as quickly as I would with any other religion that I don't believe in or don't think it's credible to believe in. I'm not concerned with that aspect. Now, what I would say about Scientology is there are probably plenty of people who are Scientologists that aren't directly involved in the disgusting things that go on in that church, just like how in the Catholic priest, not every Catholic is a pedophile that's having their way with altar boys, right? So I would say on all the cases of a person in that institution whose life's been positively improved, I can't say Scientology is a bad thing for them, because it's certainly improved individuals' lives. Now, the fact that the institution could be corrupt, it's like, okay, well, we can say maybe an institution's broken or has a lot of things wrong with it, but I don't see why you have to, say that means we should also blame the guy who believes in something stupid just because it makes his life better. Right? Because there are going to be people who are even Scientologists whose lives have been improved for them adopting some ridiculous, dogma. That's going to be true. I'm okay with those individuals, though. It's just like you can't blame everything historically on everybody who believes it thereafter, because it's unrelated. You got to look at the individual. You can't just generalize it all and then say overall more bad than good, therefore it's a failure. You have to say, well, at the scale of a one individual, it can be good, and for that person it's been hugely beneficial, right? So you have to recognize it's good in some aspects, and just completely saying everybody has to move past it in all capacities would clearly, could be a detriment to that guy whose life's been changed by it.
So I was thinking about this actually, because I think you asked me specifically in a previous episode if someone could prove to me that there was you could perform a utilitarian calculus in which religion does improve people's lives. would I still have a problem with it? And I think I kind of dodged the question, if I remember correctly, or I gave at least an answer that wasn't satisfying to you. And so, there's 2 points to that. There is the point that, many new atheists are always stressing. Even if something is useful, that does not necessarily make it true. And I think and I still think that the truth of religion is an important point that has to be discussed whenever you discuss religion. But the second point is, I'd like to give you a more satisfying answer to your question a couple episodes removed. If someone could prove to me, or at least use my presuppositions and my intuitions to show that, okay, religion actually does do more good, then I think I would be forced to say, if I didn't want to be contradictory, that yes, I would have to say that religion does much less good, but our religion, I would have to stop. I would have to minimize maybe my criticisms of religion. But again, it's you can point to one certain examples. You can say, well, Bob down the street, was a heroin addict, and but then he found Jesus and his life was turned around. It's like, okay, that's fine, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to look at the big picture, and I think if you look at the big picture, if you kind of look at humanity as a whole, if you look at if you do that utilitarian calculus, I think you do come to the conclusion that overall religion has done more harm because of the dogma, because of the irrationality, and it would be better if people could come to these, could view morality, could view, just human relations from a rational and a secular lens.
Okay, so the first point being good, not necessarily meaning it's true. 110% agree. I don't think I was trying to make a claim about it being true because it could help those people. I was conceding that it would be false. So it's like, okay, that was the first point. And I do appreciate that you went back and answered that question that I asked you about, because I do remember asking you about that, and I was dissatisfied. So I'm more satisfied with this answer, but there's a specific part of your second analysis that I'd want to address, I guess. And it's not that, I guess, I don't think you answered the question wrong by looking at it, by your big picture analysis. I don't think your big picture analysis of everything is incorrect. My problem is with using that big picture analysis to make any other claim, right? Because my whole thing is, me being an individual and other individuals existing means that people are going to have their own values. Some people aren't going to care that things aren't necessarily true, like we apparently do. And I did not mean to sound as sanctimonious as that came off, but I couldn't convince myself to, I guess, be scholarly in terms of religion and convince myself it's true, because I don't think just because it helps people it's true. That makes no sense to me. I couldn't believe it. Now, other people, though, if it turns their life around, maybe they're willing to overlook some things. Like Jesus' resurrection, I don't know, doesn't matter. I'm going to believe in this because this has helped fix me. And I don't think I'm in a position to where I should be able to make claims about how important that experience is on other people. So even though you can stack up the dead bodies from the Crusades and pin them 1-to-1, I think the comparison is, I guess, pointless, because the big picture doesn't tell you anything. The big picture can say, historically, there have been terrible uses of religion. And it's like, sure, but that doesn't guide me forward. That doesn't tell me how I should feel about other people living their life. And I don't think I really should care. Now, if I was like looking for a mate, would I want them to raise my kids religious? Like, not particularly. So then I'd care. Or if I'm wondering how people are informed on their values or having a philosophical conversation, I could care. But like when the MyPillow CEO turns his life around from being a drug addict and becomes a CEO of a big company, and then he swears it's Jesus, good for him. he's not a bum anymore. He's a rich dude. Great. I'm fine with that. I'm willing to see that happened. That was good. And everybody in his circle has turned out better because of the message of Christ, whether it's true or not. And I'm willing to make that concession. And for that reason, I'm not comfortable throwing out religion in the way that Sam Harris is, even though I'm never going to be a proponent. I think that's my sticking point and my difference that I'm like really kind of fleshing out.
No, I appreciate that argument. And it's a very nuanced argument, and I think I can understand why you would come to that position. And I guess I'll just kind of maybe I'll just tell you why I don't come to that position. And just to be clear, I'm not some pseudo-Stalinist who wants to control people. I'm not, proposing that, the Vanguard Party take over and then, seize all religious property and, persecute anyone who dares say, they believe in God. As I think I've said before, I coming from the United States, I have a respect for the religious pluralism and the separation between church and state that we have. I think that is one of the most important values, and I think this is where almost my patriotic side comes out. That is one of the greatest achievements of any country in human history. I don't think any country has the degree to religious freedom that we do in the United States. So I too believe that people need to they need to have the freedom to look at these different religions and decide, okay, I believe in this religion or that religion, or I don't believe in any religion at all. And I would never deny that right, and I will defend to my death people's right to be religious. In the same way, I don't think people should smoke cigarettes. I don't think people should, drink every day. I don't think that there are things that I don't agree with, but I can agree. I can agree that they have the right to do them. Well, okay, go ahead, and then I have a broader point to make.
Yeah, I have a very specific point on that, so that's why I don't want to lose track of it. As much as I feel like I've been defending religion, relatively speaking, I mean, considering I'm still calling it dogma, I'm not really doing a great job defending it if anybody religious happened to listen to this. But compared to talking to a new atheist, I think I've been on the side of defending it. Now, with that said, I think I take a different tact from you in terms of what you just talked about, because I don't think separation of church and state is possible. So I really hate that phrase, so I just need to say it, because it's not what happens. Because if you have a democracy with a state run by people who could be religious, their religion is going to shape their a priori perspective and the views of the world. And then you don't have a separation of church and state anymore, which might happen to segue into some rooting of values and lenses and a priori structures, which hopefully we might be able to tack onto the end of this podcast, which we'd get to in a minute. The other thing I wanted to say was I kind of hate how much we care about freedom of religion in the United States, because I don't find it uniquely important. I guess historically it's been seen as a very important thing, but I don't think it's, as a secular person, it seems ridiculous that we're willing to protect that above all else when we should be protecting every piece of individuality. And it bugs me that that's the one that's constantly singled out, because it's like, sure, you have the right to believe whatever you want. And it's like, but you don't have the right to plenty of other stuff that seems more important to a lot of people, like your own property or your income or your labor, or, to choose certain things in terms of insurance, or, there's a lot of stuff we don't have the right to that seem very important, and religion is constantly singled out like that makes our nation free. And I kind of just reject seeing our nation as free and religion being the excuse to see it that way. So that's my political anti-government tangent of the day that I needed to somehow shoehorn into our religious Peterson-Harris debate. Sorry for derailing whatever thought you had that was going to make a good point. I just couldn't contain myself because I'm just that guy. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. This is, our podcast is meant to just, get our thoughts out there and see where they go. Okay. I am going to. I don't remember the exact quote. I should have written it down. But Sam Harris made the point that, you can be ignorant of how good life can be. You can, and of course, this is kind of a sticking point for both Peterson and Harris, because Harris read The Moral Landscape and he said, "Okay, you basically gave the heaven and hell story. You basically recreated the heaven and hell story." And of course, Sam Harris really doesn't like that conception of it. But basically, Sam is saying you can. There's a certain kind of world in which there's a maximum amount of suffering, and then there's another kind of world which is the maximum amount of freedom and pleasure and health. So again, politically speaking, I can't force that on people. I can't say you have to abandon religion, but I do think that the secular life is far. It's removed from the dogma. It's far more rational, and you can. There is a certain kind of life that there's a certain level of satisfaction that I don't think you can get if you are muddled in these Stone Age these stories that were created when people knew nothing about astronomy. They knew nothing about the germ theory of disease. They knew nothing about the great philosophers hadn't come around yet. The possibilities, we haven't really had a broadly secular society much in human history. I guess the United States is probably the closest you come to it, but there are flaws, like you said, and we don't really know yet the limits of allowing people to be as free as possible. And I think to be as free as possible, we have to, as a society, as a culture, overall, we have to abandon those stories.
Yeah, that's a. So I guess I don't want to get bogged down in this because I still want to talk about a priori structures. I feel like I at least want to touch on it. Maybe we might have to retread that. I feel like I am a person who I feel like that was gonna be maybe an edgy joke, so I'm gonna say it anyways. I feel like a Hispanic person who just showed up to a whitewashed Mexican restaurant and it's Taco Tuesday, because your use of the word freedom there is really in a way that requires levels of nuance to maybe unpack that I don't know if we're ready to do over an hour into this episode. So let's not do that. And instead, let's talk about the other huge sticking point that they spend probably half the debate on, which is Jordan Peterson getting very triggered by the fact that Sam Harris values intuition a lot. Because Sam Harris kind of seems to be, for my approximation of what was happening, is Sam Harris is pushed on how to make a decision, and then Sam Harris kind of says, well, we have intuitions about what is good and bad. If somebody said, what are we having for dinner? And then you pointed at your pet and you said, well, we have this animal that we could eat for meat. Maybe we should just kill that and eat that. And then no, a reasonable person would say, why kill the pet when we could go to a grocery store? And you're like, oh yeah, that's reasonable. And Sam's saying this it's profound about intuition on how things are clearly obvious what is right to do in many scenarios. And then Jordan Peterson tries to point out, well, Sam, it's not that obvious, Sam. Every scenario you walk into, well, what is right and what is wrong? And then Sam kind of just says, intuition, you kind of figure it out. And I was very bothered by this. This is the first time where I've actually kind of felt in question of Sam's intelligence in a weird way, where I don't want to say he's stupid, but maybe it's because of his voice combined with the way he talks and is generally nuanced. But I expect him to have such a better answer than what he was really giving me. Was I wrong to feel this disappointed in him? Do you have Do you have thoughts on how he was defending, I guess, the general concept of having an a priori structure to make decisions? Because it didn't seem like he had one at all. And I don't know. It was just kind of, if you think something's really bad, it probably is really bad. We generally know it's bad. But then I also want to add, in my approximation, a ton of people are in favor of horrible things because a ton of people want to tax me more. They want to take more money and confiscate more stuff from everybody to give it to other people. My approximation is that is terrible and not okay and very unethical. But a lot of people disagree. So it's clearly not obvious. So how does Sam reason to one and not the other? He doesn't have an answer. It's just intuition. So that bugged me really bad. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I could tell that really bugged you. I was like waiting for some expletives to come out, but I remember we're on recording and we're trying to be like somewhat professional. Okay, that's a joke. There are one point that kind of interested me about that was Sam Harris was basically making an argument. I don't know if you noticed this. It was kind of an aside, but he was kind of making the argument that at some level, moral philosophy is only helpful at the extremes. At some level, moral philosophy doesn't really matter because people are going to kind of act a certain way. There's sort of like a street morality, as you could say, that we all follow. And he gave an example like, when your kid is in a burning building, obviously you're going to go save your kid. But he said, where moral philosophy comes in is when it's your neighbor's kid in a burning building, because you want to save the kid, but you're also worried, well, what if I die? Then my kid is going to be orphaned. And so that was kind of interesting where Sam was kind of insinuating that, well, at some level, philosophy is kind of useless. I don't know if he would say it in those words, but philosophy in some sense doesn't matter when it comes to moral questions. And I guess there's a couple kind of things I want to touch on. I don't think morality, I think it's challenging. So I don't think, as we kind of said in the last podcast, I do consider myself a moral realist. I do think there are such a things as right and wrong moral answers, but I don't think they're necessarily easy to figure out. I think it requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of reading. It requires a lot of thinking. Because it kind of gets back to something else we've discussed about, which is kind of the nature of truth. And I bring this up because sometime maybe we should do a podcast devoted to that. But I guess what I'll just say is this. Like, here's the thing about science that people don't understand. You don't prove things in science. Science is not looking for transcendental capital T truth. Science is not looking for something that is just true all the time, always, forever. The scientific method is meant to come up with the best approximation of reality. And what scientists, it's hard for non-scientists to understand this, but I'm kind of pursuing a science degree myself, so I'm kind of getting exposed to this in my studies. Those approximations can be wildly off base. The science of the 9th century is very different from the science of the 21st century. And so I just kind of wanted to get that out there, that you can't what a scientist is trying to do, they're trying to, the way I think about it like this, it's as if you come across, imagine you move into a new home and there's a bunch of stuff in the attic that someone left behind, and you find a puzzle piece, and it's you don't really know where it goes, but you're kind of curious. So then you find another puzzle piece, and you find another puzzle piece, but you might never find the entire puzzle. You might never know exactly what the whole puzzle means or what the whole picture is, but you can find, you might be able to find enough puzzle pieces to get a general idea of what that picture is. And I suppose, kind of to tie back in, I think that's kind of the way we also have to approach morality. But I will say I'm a bit I'm kind of still trying to figure out how you come across moral truths. So I don't really feel like I can give a very good answer to your question, but that's my answer for now.
And the thing is, I guess why I was so struck by it is because I'm not necessarily disagreeing with Sam that it comes down to intuition. I'm just frustrated because I thought he'd have a better answer because he seems so insistent on showing how things can be grounded in morals, yet he really doesn't, other than beyond intuition. I guess based on what you were saying though, I think the disagreement we might have is I don't know if there's a lot of value in moral philosophy, given that most of the things are hypothetical trolley problems that don't come up often, and it will be the street morality that prevails because that comes up more regularly. Now,
I'm not sure we disagree about that, though, actually.
Okay.
Maybe I wasn't quite clear, but I'm not quite sure we actually disagree about that so much.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear then. we don't disagree on something. That's progress. The only other thing I wanted to add, God, I just need to get that thought back. It was how it makes me, to some extent, despite his terrible flaws, makes me appreciate Kant, because Kant at least laid out what he supposed could at least be guidelines of what is moral and what isn't. And to some extent, I kind of like Kant's framework, because even though I don't think it, I think it captures what is ethical, but I don't think it necessarily captures what you should always do. Right. So a lot of people criticize Kant because, based on his principles, lying is always morally incorrect. And I would say the act of lying is morally incorrect. But if somebody's asking where your family is and the guy has an axe and he's going to murder your family, you should still lie to him. It doesn't. But I'm saying the act of lying is deception. And I could see how deception should be inherently, in almost a Platonic way, be considered wrong and immoral. So I actually appreciate Kant to some extent, because I think a lot of his criticisms are about practicality, and I don't really think his theory needs to really explain practical purposes. But I guess my takeaway was, at least he tried to lay something out, unlike Sam, who kind of was looking at it and he's like, well, you're going to have intuitions, and most of the time we agree, so that's good enough. So I was kind of annoyed, much like how Jordan Peterson is clearly not enthused with this answer. He was clearly, because Jordan Peterson's answer is the same as Sam's, but he at least tries to root why our intuitions exist. And I can respect that. He pretty much says, here's the human universals that shape our intuitions. So I feel like his answer is almost better, because it's at least more, it's more supported. But I think we're hitting over an hour 10, and that's usually like where we top out at. So maybe any closing thoughts on either what I just said, or more things we didn't touch on that you just want to tack on a few things, and then I'll sign off.
I guess what I would like to say before we wrap up this episode is I think actually it would be a good idea for us to tackle Kant at some point, because I think I'm detecting something here. I think we both actually like Kant, or we both respect Kant and his arguments, but I take it we either have a different interpretation of Kant's philosophy, or we just we're just very different in our Kantian approaches. Because of course Kant is a very interesting figure, and as many people say, he wasn't a very good writer, so it's hard to know actually what Kant thought. But I would actually say that some of the reasons that I kind of come up to the belief that some of the reasons that I believe in such a thing as universal morality does stem from Kantian thinking. And of course, as I say, Kant's a mouthful, and it's like, some people debate, well, did he believe in God? It's like, well, maybe not. And of course, he was trying to square away sort of the romantic idealism with he was trying to square away and come to a consensus between rationalism and empiricism. But I also get he was I feel like I bring up Jean-Jacques Rousseau a lot, but Kant was a reader of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, so there was also a romantic strain in his thought. And so that's something else we should add to our list to talk about is Immanuel Kant.
Okay, well, I'm glad we could at least agree on that. And I do have some probably interesting thoughts on Kant, mostly based out of me being uneducated. I've only had a brief overview, but I've almost, to some extent, I feel like I probably like him for reasons he did not intend, but I think that's still a credit to him. The credit to him that I could take what he said and then derive something a little different, but think that applies instead is better than a lot of people who I'll read and either think are completely wrong or think like Sam Harris that he's not wrong, but he's not saying anything profound, which is frustrating because you want to hear something profound that you agree with, you know?
That's kind of like the true of like all philosophers. I think like philosophy is one of those fields that there really is no, it's almost like the ultimate postmodern field. Like the first thing you learn in philosophy is no one agrees about philosophy. And so, the thing, that's the interesting thing when you read philosophers is people come up with wildly different interpretations of the very same philosophers and their beliefs. Which might also kind of tie into the question of, is it even useful?
Well, that's kind of what I was getting at too with when we were talking about moral philosophy. So yeah, it all kind of ties together there. Okay, well, that was our loose using of Peterson, Harris, and some of their topics to incite our discussion. Hopefully you guys found it helpful or useful or at least entertaining, because I was a little fired up a couple times there. Yeah, I was definitely pretty fired up a couple times.
As was I. I've been like drinking my coffee over here, so I'm just like completely caffeinated.
So everybody, thanks for listening. As always, you could find me on Twitter at MattKeckBlog. Although with all the hysteria going on, I have not been particularly active there because I don't want to get sucked down into 30 minutes of watching rioting videos. I'm just not into that. You can find us in video form on YouTube if you type in the Anti-Philosopher to find Matt's YouTube channel where he posts the video version, and you could actually see how we unintentionally, like, I'm wearing this black shirt and I have this overgrown facial hair, and for some reason a bright light keeps hitting my co-host here, and he's wearing a white shirt, and that actually symbolizes the narrative between Harris and Peterson and how Harris is really preaching heresy in the devil's word. So yeah, everybody, thank you. We appreciate your time. Keep coming back for more. We hope you enjoy it. And signing off, Matt and Matthew.